This is your English grandfather, your daddy's father, making his report about his life to amuse you and possibly to interest you when you grow a little older and can follow some of the weird things I have to say. Your mummy asked about my childhood. Now that, because it is now August of 1991, was 71 years ago. And though they may tell you that in fact, as you grow older, your memories are clearer about the very early years of your life, I haven't found that. The memories of my childhood are washed in the sort of feeling that you read of in stories. The wonderful summer weathers, the glorious winters with snow on the ground and skating on frozen ponds. Whether this actually happened or not, I'm none too certain. My name, of course, as you will know, is Stanley Makepeace-Lott. The Makepeace and the Lott are hyphenated, and I'll tell you more about that later. I have an older brother, Tommy, which is spelled T-O-M-M-I-E, Makepeace-Lott. He lives in California and does not use the hyphen, just as your father, who was christened David Makepeace-Lott, also doesn't use the hyphen. What I can remember most from my childhood is, I suppose, the house in which I lived, or to be more precise, the two houses, because my childhood was slightly different from the normal in that we never went away for holidays. We had a second house some 15 miles away from Liverpool, where we were born, on the coast of Formby. You can look these places up on an atlas and see just where it is I'm talking about. The Liverpool house was in a place called Faulkner Square, and it was unique in that the main living room of the house was 2 stories high. It had a coved and domed ceiling with some elegant plasterwork around it, a fine white marble Adams fireplace, because in those days one had open coal fires, not central heating, and it had 2 large French windows which opened out onto the roof of our nursery. Because of this very large room, it was in fact some 36 feet long by 20 feet wide. The whole house was built with a sort of step in its middle. There were 4 stories, but at the front half of the house, although there were rooms on each of these 4 floors, on the back side of the house there were only 3 rooms. The 2 that represented the height of the sitting room, and 1 above and 1 below. The ground floor of the house, which was of course on street level, had to be reached by going up and down stairs. There were steps outside the front door which took you to the hall, and on that floor there was just a dining room. You then went downstairs, arriving at the ground level and going along a passageway out towards the back, off that passageway, was our nursery. This again was a most unusual room. It too was the 36-foot width, but it was 24 feet in depth. It had a very large window in its roof. This is called a skylight, and it was rather like something you might see in a factory. It had been put there because the house had been built for an artist. Now, artists don't want sunlight directly onto their work, so the glass faced north, and you got no sunlight from the north. I'm not sure that you got a great deal of sunlight in Liverpool at all. Liverpool was a city of some 750,000 people, and its main purpose in life was being a port. It was a very wealthy city in the beginning of this century, but has been going down in wealth ever since. I'm afraid that now, in the 1990s, it is what might be called a trouble spot. However, in my youth, it was a pleasant enough place in which to live. It had everything that one wanted by way of culture: a fine museum, fine art gallery, magnificent Philharmonic hall for a very famous orchestra, and a playhouse that is a repertory company for theatre productions, which was deemed to be one of the best in Britain. In describing the house, I told you that you went down some steps to get to the nursery, or the level of the nursery, but in fact you also had further steps to go down to get to the kitchen. Now, this kitchen was nothing like that with which you were familiar. For one thing, although it had gas cooking by the time I can remember it, which was, say, 1925, before then it had relied upon a coal stove on which everything was heated, and even my date of 1925 reminds me that then the hot water for the house was heated in a massive boiler fueled by coal. We had, because we were reasonably well off, 2 maids who lived in. This, of course, meant that my mother had no actual housework to do, although she did a considerable amount of cooking, of which I shall tell you more in a moment. My mother and father, then. My father's name was Reginald Makepeace-Lott, which he always wrote out in full as R. Makepeace-Lott, but didn't put in a hyphen. He married an Emily Maud Cheeseman. Now, we, my brother and I, were not born until our mother was around about 40 years of age, which of course is fairly late in life. By this time, my father, whose profession was that of a lawyer, called in England a solicitor, and he was quite a well-known man in Liverpool, and really we then moved in a circle of people who were also well known in Liverpool. I'm afraid that I do not remember a very great deal about either my mother or my father, for the simple reason that we were looked after by the maids. I do remember that afternoon tea at 4 o'clock, or thereabouts, was a social function at which I was occasionally allowed to attend. I was a much more social animal than my brother Tommy, who I suppose did attend these teas, but of whom I have very, very few memories. I have very few memories of him at all, at any age of his life, because our interests were always almost opposite. I have liked what, for want of a better phrase, I will call the cultural side of life, and he has been almost always concentrating his energies on the practical side, and he has made a very great success of his life. Anyway, all my stories about my childhood exclude Tommy, because he really didn't share in it. We did go to the same schools and the same university, but because he is 18 months older, he always went a little before me. So we never shared any of this education time together. Actually, I was one of those sickening children who was good at school, and at what we called in those days a preparatory school, where you started school at 7 and finished at 14, I won a form prize every year for being top of the form. However, I soon stopped that silly nonsense, because when I was 12, I missed a whole year of school by being ill. Unfortunately, because I had been good, the headmaster of the school decided that instead of moving up the one form that you automatically do at the end of each year, I had to move up 2 forms to stay with the pupils with whom I had gone through the school from the beginning. This was a great disaster, because I stopped learning some of the things which I would otherwise have learned. I always like to say that's why I can't spell. I think in that year we learned to spell. Certainly I had to give up Latin, and I also had to give up winning the top prize of the form. However, I still did rather well, and unfortunately did so well in the examinations that when I moved up to the next school, Liverpool College, instead of going into the entrance form, which you would do if you just went there, because I had done very well in the exams, I went into the next one up, and this caused further trouble in that I then qualified to go to university a year before they would even take me in. I was technically 16, because the exams were in July and I wasn't 17 till August, when I could have gone to university. Actually, I didn't go till I was 17, the following October. Anyway, that's enough of education. What we are really talking about is childhood memories and the life I lived as a child. As I have suggested, Liverpool being a city, there was a lot of cold in the winter. Not anything like the cold that you know of Prince George, but winter, which started sometime at the end of November, was a period of, in those days, fogs and of snow and of what was for us quite a low temperature. Certainly it seldom went much below freezing. You would laugh to hear us talk about the cold. Of course, There was no double glazing in those days, as well as there being no central heating. So, in fact, we hadn't made the correct provisions to keep out any worse cold, if it had ever come. And we rather revelled in the snow. Unfortunately, revels, if those are the things that I'm talking about, were fairly few and far between, simply because we had very few friends. Because we were born so late in our mother's life, those of her friends who had had children had them much earlier, and they were all much older than we were. At school, because this was several miles away from our home, although we may have made friends, we didn't really mix with them. Very few people had motor cars. We certainly didn't, although we could have afforded one, but because we lived fairly near the centre of Liverpool, the parking problems, if you had a motor car, were immense. None of the houses in our area had garages, so one would have had to have left the car in the street. And because there were no broad highways, cars weren't all that much use. We used taxis. So often that I can still remember the telephone number, Royal 2580, of the local taxi rank, from which I would summon a taxi to come and take my father to work, or us out the evenings to a cinema, or a theatre, or a concert hall. This having no friends of my own age within easy reach did make me a very solitary small boy, and my main interests were reading and writing and telling stories, in particular telling, because every Sunday we walked as a whole family about 2 miles to my father's mother. Now, this grandmother of mine was very old when I can remember her, and in fact I have very few memories, and certainly none of them are interesting. But on the way there, Tommy walked ahead with his father, I walked alongside my mother, and I invariably, both on the way there and on the way back, told her a story. They tended to be continuous series, all about the same characters, but I did try at least to make them interesting enough, though I fear that my mother would have probably listened to anything I had to say. I never met or talked to any girls at all until the final year before I went up to university, and then I only met because I was sent to dancing classes. At university you were expected to attend the various balls and dances, and you were provided with evening dress, which to you is a tuxedo, and were expected to be able to do the rather complicated steps of the what I still prefer to think of as proper dancing, where you and your partner were entwined and did the same things. None of this frenetic rushing about, flinging yourself into your own thing that seems to pass for dancing nowadays. When I was 7, I actually started to learn to play golf, and I have off and on played it ever since. It is a magnificent game for a lonely child, in that you do play it by yourself. Unlike, say, tennis, you do not need a partner or an opponent. And in fact, you play this against the course, as it were. I'm not going to give you a talk about golf. I hope perhaps one day it may interest you. But because it is a lonely game, if you play it that way, I had no friends either on or off the golf course with whom I did anything. In fact, it is almost true to say I just had no friends until I went up to university. There I had friends. Not only my own co-students, I was studying engineering, and in fact was Liverpool University's first aeronautical engineering student. They devised a course specially for me, which I never completed, and I was part of the science faculty for half of the work I did, and the engineering faculty for the other half. But what happened of more interest at university was that I started a jazz band. Jazz music of the old-fashioned sort, of the late 30s and early 40s, with such marvellous names of which you will have heard, such as Louis Armstrong, had fascinated me ever since I had first heard it. And I was given by my parents a drum kit and played the drums. They also provided a piano in the nursery, and I was enabled therefore to hold rehearsals, practices of the band I formed, because we lived within 10 minutes walk of the university, and the people with whom I was playing could all come along to my house. Mother also installed a gas cooker in this nursery, so that when we were practicing, we didn't have to go without food. We could bring along girls who would cook. The idea that the boy might cook had never seemed to enter anybody's mind in the 1930s. So here was I at university meeting girls for the first time. It is quite an experience. You, of course, have played with boys ever since you first went to school. As I say, I hadn't even spoken to one. Now, girls to young boys are quite frightening things when you're not used to them. And I'm afraid that my emotional response didn't do anything for the amount of work I was able to get through. As I say, I never actually completed my course at university, although this wasn't due just to my lack of work. It was due to the war, and of that I will talk later. As I have just said, I had three interests in life: my music, if you can call jazz music, and my storytelling, and my golf. It would be nice to think that my aeronautical engineering provided a great interest, but it didn't. It was the glamour of aeroplanes which really attracted me, and because of this I volunteered to go into the Air Force when the war came along. I thought that the training I had received would be of value to my country. The powers that be didn't accept this version of life, and I wasn't made use of as an engineer of any sort during the war. In fact, I never really saw an aeroplane at all. It is true that when I had volunteered, I expected to. I even hoped that I might fly in one. as a navigator, because wearing glasses I couldn't be a pilot. But as I say, that wasn't to be. They decided that I was needed, and by golly I wasn't, in the intelligence service. It's called MI6, and I am a great expert on the vagaries and performances and history of the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, but know very little about the Royal Air Force. So I am not going to weary you with stories about the war. I am technically not supposed to talk about my work in intelligence, although I don't pay much attention to that. So much has been published about the sort of thing we did. My ambitions were, of course, almost choked by the war. Your main ambition was to get through it alive. Now, I know this sounds perhaps rather silly, because the actual casualties the British suffered were fairly low. But nevertheless, one had been brought up to the concept that the bombers would wipe the floor, and you with it. So there would be the question of work after the war. And I had no idea what that would be. The fact that work was essential is connected with your father. Because during the war, I had married a WAAF, that is, a member of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, WAAF. Her name was Irene Burberry, and we had been at the same station together. Now, I'm not going to dwell on my first marriage. It ended in 1955, and its only glory was your father. One of the greatest moments of my life was holding this small baby in my arms for the first time. Unfortunately, his mother didn't share this excitement, and there were times when I alone was left to look after David. However, we did go together to Vienna. This in the early 1950s, when I sold up everything I possessed, which wasn't a great deal, bought a car and a caravan, and went to live in Vienna in what was actually an open-air swimming pool, and it was outside the city, although within the postal district, and it was called Rodown. Your father went to school in Rodown. I wrote in the caravan while his mother taught English at the Berlitz School, and I also taught English to help the money along. It was during this time that I was divorced. This was not a happy moment, but it was what Irene considered to be a release for me. She suffered from depression, an actual illness. It was, however, because of the divorce that I changed my name to Makepeace-Lott with a hyphen. A rather complicated story, but basically it depended on the fact that in Austrian law, the judge who considered a divorce application was chosen from the lists by the first two letters of your surname. The judge for L.O. was not a pleasant fellow, I was told, but the judge for M.A. was a very happy chap who would give you a divorce almost on request. I came back to England in 1956, leaving David and his mother in Vienna for a little while. He will tell you better than I can of his life in England when he finally came back a few months later to join me. By that time, I had got work with the firm of Babcock and Wilcox, and through their good offices, I had been able to buy a small bungalow in a place called Hockley. Although I was technically divorced, I brought both David and his mother to live with me in Hockley, because I felt it incumbent upon me to look after her. Before this, in fact, before I went to Vienna, I had had my first novel accepted and published. It was a thriller, and I wrote its sequel, but had no further success with thrillers. I did write, when in Vienna, a science fiction story, Escape to Venus, which did get published, and which had some slight influence on my next career. The job I had got at the end of the war had been with the Ministry of Food, and this was an institution which looked after food rationing. Food still had to be rationed in England till the early 1950s, but the job which they offered me when the Ministry of Food was disbanded was with the Ministry of Defence, and I had no desire whatsoever to have anything to do with arms or armament, the procurement of which is the main responsibility of the Ministry of Defence, which is why I resigned and went to Vienna. As I said, I had got a job with Babcock and Wilcox. I was employed as an abstractor in their research library, dealing mainly with their atomic energy section. In this library worked Fiona McIntyre. On meeting her, I suddenly found that I wanted the freedom which had been granted to me those years before by my divorce in Vienna. I also wanted a better job, so I applied, and finally it was accepted by the United Kingdom Atomic Energy Authority as a science writer in their public relations department. This was in 1959. In 1960, Fiona and I got married. She was 26 and I was 40. This age difference did not please her parents. However, I must say immediately, not have chosen me for a son-in-law. When the day for our marriage arrived, they attended at church. Her father gave her away to me, and from that moment onwards, both of them treated me as a son. I stayed for 10 years with the Atomic Energy Authority, and during that time wrote leaflets, pamphlets, booklets for them, and the scripts for many exhibitions. These were exciting times in atomic energy research, and under the British system, all that research was government funded and undertaken by the Atomic Energy Authority. this had been made, then the results were passed out to industry to build atomic power stations. And indeed, the world's first commercial atomic power station had been built at Calder Hall in Cumberland in 1956. While I was with the Atomic Energy Authority, I wrote 2 non-fiction books, one about desalination, which is removing the salt from seawater, and the other a book in a careers book for boys series about getting a job in atomic energy. I fondly believed that I could also write some more acceptable novels. This is something which I have not yet been able to achieve, and if, in fact, I could have my life over again, one thought has occurred to me, that after the publication of my first novel, I should not have gone looking for work, but should have lived in a garret and continued to write. This because I believed one could be a dilettante author, as had happened between the wars, where you could throw off every 3 or 4 years a nice new novel, and that it would be accepted and well received. Life, however, had changed, and after the war, publishers wanted a new book from an author every 6 months. I'm sure I could actually have provided this, but had I done so, 2 of the great treasures in my life would have been denied me. The first was, of course, your father. The second was the daughter with which Fiona presented me in February 1963, Katrina. You have met her, and I'm sure you liked her. She is now married to Bill Marshall, although she has kept her name just as your mother has, kept her maiden name, and she now sings under the name of Katrina Makepeace-Lott, although, of course, her career is only just beginning. Fiona gave up her work after the birth of Katrina, but, as I have said, she was a professionally trained librarian with all the right qualifications, and was able, some 3 or so years later, to get a job locally in the public library system. In fact, by 1969, she was earning as much money as I was, which in England was fairly unusual. Women get paid considerably less than men, although it's not supposed to be that way. Katrina, of course, was at a day nursery, and after this she was being looked after by a neighbouring family who had some children of her age with whom she could play. Unfortunately, this family had to move, and we were left with the decision as to whether Fiona or I should give up work to stay at home to look after our daughter. Well, Fiona was generous enough to allow me to stop working so that I could devote myself full-time to writing novels. We therefore repeated the pattern of my earlier life, sold everything we possessed, and bought a caravan, a rather large double caravan, in which we could live more cheaply. However, success did not follow this sacrifice, And in 1971, as we saw the prices of houses begin to rocket, we moved out and bought ourselves another house, still in Hockley, because of course Katrina was going to school in that part of the world. Unfortunately, this was the date at which I decided to have a heart attack. Not an event I remember with any pleasure. What I do remember with pleasure is that shortly after this, Katrina got herself into the local grammar school in Southend. This was a girls-only school, but grammar schools were deemed to give the best education within the state system, and we couldn't possibly have afforded to have sent her to a public school. As we then wanted to move from Hockley into Southend to make travel to school simpler, it was decided that I should try and get some work, and we could buy a house in Southend. Both these things we achieved. I went back into the civil service and, in fact, stayed there in HM Customs and Excise until I finally retired at 65 in 1985. As Fiona is going to be talking on the other side of this tape, I will leave her to tell you much more about Katrina. But of two things I was very proud. She firstly became the head girl of her school, and secondly, she got a scholarship from it to go to Cambridge as a choral scholar at Selwyn College. Now, although both Liverpool and Cambridge say they are universities, I assure you that they are not comparable. Cambridge is a magnificent place, and Liverpool is just an ordinary provincial university. I must also add that there was no war coming along, thank heaven, and Katrina duly got her degree, whereas of course I had not. As I had joined the Air Force before my special course had concluded, and although it was true I could have gone back to university at the end of the war, I didn't, simply because, in the first case, your father was a most important part of my life and couldn't be left. The second, more prosaic reason was that when I started to learn about them, aeroplanes had pieces of wood that went round in the front and had possibly two wings held together with all sorts of struts and wires, whereas at the end of the war their engines didn't have propellers stuck on them, but they had holes at the back out of which they blew jet streams. At the time when Katrina was going up to Cambridge, we moved again. This away from the Southend area to a place called Kettering in Northamptonshire, roughly speaking in the middle of England, and with much easier access to Cambridge than we had from Southend. As I have suggested, there was such a difference between Cambridge University and Liverpool University, it will come as no surprise to you to know that Katrina lived in Cambridge at Selwyn College and didn't simply walk from home to university. Because of the large rise in house prices while we were in Southend, we were able to buy a very pleasant house in Kettering. In actual fact, you have been there, though I don't suppose you will remember it, although you have plenty of photographs of you at the place. Now, grandfathers are supposed to be full of words of wisdom, and as I am approaching the end of this tape, now is the moment at which I should be offering you those words. However, to be perfectly honest, such ideas get mixed up when the image that I have of you, the person to whom I am speaking, is that of an adorable young girl whose life ahead of her will be so completely different from anything I have ever experienced that really there are only the usual platitudes to be said, and I refuse to say these. The only things that really matter in life are to love and to be loved, and you will find that out for yourself, and don't need any words from me at all. So, goodbye, dear Jenny. This is the end of my tape, but my thoughts go on and include you always.